They refused to hire me because I was black, but then I became their boss. The glass doors swung open with a soft hiss as she stepped into the building, her resume neatly tucked inside a folder she had clutched so tightly that her knuckles ached. The lobby gleamed with polished marble floors and walls, lined with photographs of executives in sharp suits, their smiles framed in gold. She had dressed with care, her blazer pressed, her hair pulled neatly back, her shoes shining. Every detail had been thought through, every step practiced in her mind. She told herself again and again that she belonged here, that her qualifications and long hours of preparation would be enough. The receptionist looked up, polite but distant, and after a brief check of the schedule, gestured for her to take a seat. She sat on the edge of the leather chair, folder balanced on her lap, her back straight. Around her, employees moved briskly through the lobby, their badges clipped to expensive jackets, their voices low and confident as they carried conversations about meetings and deals. She tried not to stare, but she felt the weight of their glances as they noticed her waiting. She adjusted her blazer and forced herself to breathe slowly. When her name was called, she stood quickly, offering a smile that carried both nerves and determination. She followed the hiring manager down a hallway lined with glass offices where men and women tapped away at glowing screens. The room they entered was plain but spotless, a large desk dominating the space. She sat when invited, carefully placing her folder in front of her. The manager leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie with a look that already seemed impatient. She began to speak, her voice steady at first, describing her education, her past internships, the long hours she had put into proving herself capable. She explained her skills, her passion for the industry, her eagerness to contribute. Every word had been rehearsed in her head, refined and polished until she believed it could not fail. But as she spoke, she watched his eyes drift. He tapped a pen against his desk, nodded absent-mindedly, and offered no encouragement. When she finished, the silence that followed stretched heavy across the table. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening in a way that felt less like interest and more like judgment. Then he said it, low but unmistakable, words that cut through her composure with surgical precision. "We're not ready to make our first hire like that." His eyes flicked over her skin, then away as though the matter were already settled. The air seemed to drain from the room. Her fingers tightened on her folder until the edges bent beneath her grip. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words tangled in her throat. She had faced rejection before, but never so nakedly, never with so little effort to disguise it. The manager was already pushing her folder back across the desk, his expression neutral, his tone final. She gathered her things quietly, her movements mechanical, her face carefully composed, so he would not see the humiliation burning through her. As she stood, she forced herself to thank him for his time, though the words tasted bitter. He nodded once, already looking past her, his attention returning to the papers on his desk. The hallway back to the lobby felt longer than it had before, each step echoing against the polished floor. The receptionist glanced up briefly, her smile thin, as though she too knew the outcome without needing to ask. Outside, the air was sharp, the noise of the street jarring after the suffocating quiet of the office. She stood still for a moment, folder clutched to her chest, the words replaying in her mind, not ready for someone like her. Her heart pounded with humiliation, but beneath it a spark of something else began to stir. She had been dismissed, cast aside as though her effort meant nothing. But she knew her worth. She knew what she carried, even if they refused to see it. She walked away from the building with her back straight, the sting of rejection etched into her memory, unaware that it would become the foundation for everything she would build in the years to come. The sunlight outside was too bright when she stepped through the revolving doors, as though the world had no idea what had just been said to her inside that polished office. She still had her folder in hand, the resume she had labored over carefully tucked inside, now crumpled at the corner from how tightly she had held it during the interview. Her shoes clicked against the pavement as she walked quickly, trying to outpace the heat rising in her face. Each step felt unsteady, like her body wanted to collapse under the weight of humiliation. She had imagined this moment so differently, leaving with a smile, calling her family with good news, maybe even allowing herself to breathe a little easier. Instead, she carried rejection like a heavy stone in her chest. The city bustled around her, horns blaring, people rushing to their own appointments, none of them aware of the sentence that had just been handed to her in that cold, quiet office. "We're not ready." The words repeated in her mind again and again, each time sharper, cutting deeper. She wanted to believe she had misheard, that the pause, the look, the dismissal had meant something else, but she knew better. It had been clear in the hiring manager's eyes, in the way he had slid her resume back across the desk, as if it had been meaningless. Her qualifications, her late nights of study, the long hours of unpaid internships, none of it mattered to them. She found a bench on the sidewalk and sat down hard, the folder still clutched to her lap. People passed by in colorful coats and business suits, their lives moving forward while hers felt stuck in place. She kept her gaze down, unwilling to meet the eyes of strangers who might see the redness in her face. Her hands shook slightly as she opened the folder, smoothing the pages of her resume as if by fixing the wrinkles she could erase the sting of what had just happened. The lines of her experience stared back at her, reminders of how much she had done, how much she had given, and still, it had not been enough. Or perhaps it had been too much for them, too much in a way they had not wanted. For a moment, she allowed the shame to wash over her, her throat tight as she blinked rapidly to keep the tears from spilling. But as the wave passed, something else stirred beneath it. The humiliation was sharp, yes, but it was also clarifying. It showed her with brutal honesty what she was up against, the walls built not from her lack of skill but from their refusal to see her. If they would not open the door for her, then she would have to find another way through. She took a long breath, closing the folder and pressing it firmly against her knees. Her face still burned, her pride still stung, but her posture straightened slowly. Determination settled in her chest where despair had tried to take root. She thought of her family, of the sacrifices that had carried her this far, of the countless hours she had already invested. She refused to let this rejection be the final word on her story. When she stood again, the city seemed just as indifferent as before, but she felt a shift inside herself. The rejection would not vanish overnight. The memory of that manager's dismissive tone would follow her for a long time, but instead of breaking her, it began to harden her resolve. She turned away from the gleaming glass tower behind her and walked forward with measured steps, not yet sure where the path would lead, but certain she would not allow anyone to tell her she did not belong. She learned quickly that the world did not slow down for rejection. Rent still had to be paid, bills still arrived on schedule, and meals still needed to be bought. With the door to her dream job slammed in her face, she turned to whatever work she could find. She picked up shifts in small shops, cafes, and temporary offices, none of them glamorous, none of them close to what she had prepared herself for, but all of them necessary. Every dollar she earned went into survival, and every extra ounce of energy was saved for something bigger. The grind became her rhythm. She worked mornings in a cramped bookstore, shelving titles and ringing up purchases for customers who barely glanced at her. In the afternoons, she answered phones in a temporary office, taking calls meant for managers who never bothered to learn her name. At night, she slipped into cafes with her laptop, her textbook spread out across small tables sticky with old coffee stains. The clock often ticked past midnight before she finally shut the screen, her eyes burning, her head heavy, her body begging for sleep. She learned to live on a few hours of rest, telling herself that exhaustion was the price of progress. People looked at her differently now. Some of her peers, who had stepped easily into internships at prestigious firms, whispered about how she had fallen behind. A few acquaintances smiled politely at her in public, but spoke of her with pity in private, assuming she had failed where they had succeeded. She heard the tone in their voices when they asked how she was doing, the slight pause before they nodded, The unspoken message that they had moved on and she had been left behind. The sting of it cut deep, but she carried it silently. Instead of answering their doubts, she chose to keep working. She signed up for online courses, grinding through assignments after 12-hour days. She attended free workshops across the city, sometimes being the last one in the room to ask questions, her notebook filled with scribbles and plans. She practiced relentlessly, turning every small task into a chance to refine her skills. If she typed documents in an office, she studied formatting and organization. If she helped a customer in a store, she practiced persuasion and problem solving. Every menial job became a classroom, every mistake a teacher. Her body showed the toll of it. Her shoulders ached from hours hunched over counters and screens. Her eyes carried shadows from nights cut too short. But inside, a quiet strength was forming. The rejection that once humiliated her had become fuel. Each time she dragged herself out of bed after too little sleep, she told herself she was building something that no manager could take away. Each time she ignored the whispers, she reminded herself that her path did not have to look like theirs to matter. Years passed in this rhythm of constant motion, a cycle of work and study, failure and progress. She did not see dramatic victories. There were no headlines or applause. But brick by brick, she stacked her skills higher, laying a foundation so solid it could not be ignored forever. She carried the weight of exhaustion, but alongside it, she carried the spark of determination that had survived even the coldest rejection. It was that spark, fanned by every long night and every quiet triumph, that began to light the way toward the life she was determined to build. The years of endless work and quiet sacrifice blended together until she stopped counting the nights she had gone without sleep. What kept her going was not the approval of others, but the belief that all the small, unseen efforts were leading somewhere. That belief was tested constantly, but she held on to it like a lifeline. And then, one afternoon that seemed at first no different from the rest, the call finally came. A mid-sized firm in the city, looking for someone who could handle a new project, had found her name through one of the many applications she had sent long ago. They needed someone fast, someone reliable, someone who could manage pressure without crumbling. She was ready to prove she was that person. When she walked into the office on her first day, it was not the gleaming glass tower that had once turned her away. The walls were plainer, the furniture modest, but to her it felt like the grandest building she had ever stepped into. The hum of printers and the clack of keyboards felt like music. She sat at her desk with a determination that startled even her new coworkers. Where they dragged through mornings, she leaned into each task as if the entire company depended on it. Her work ethic became impossible to ignore. When others left at 5, she stayed until the lights dimmed, combing through reports, checking data, correcting errors no one else had noticed. When a deadline loomed, she carried stacks of files home and returned the next morning with solutions mapped out. The supervisors noticed, at first with mild surprise, then with quiet respect. They began to trust her with assignments that required more skill, more responsibility. Each time she delivered, not with excuses but with results. Her brilliance showed itself in the way she connected dots others overlooked. While colleagues repeated routines, she found ways to streamline them, shaving hours off processes that had once drained entire teams. In meetings, when she finally dared to speak, her ideas carried a clarity that silenced the room. They did not just sound good, they worked. Slowly, the same people who had barely glanced at her when she arrived began turning to her for answers. Respect came not with applause but with subtle shifts she could feel in the air. People who once dismissed her as temporary now asked for her input before making decisions. Managers began to reference her work in presentations. Her name, once buried in long email chains, now appeared in bold at the top. The whispers of pity she had endured years before were replaced with murmurs of admiration. She rose quickly, not because of favors or shortcuts, but because every long night, every moment of humiliation, every ounce of effort had sharpened her into someone who could not be ignored. She still remembered the words from the manager, who had once told her they were not ready. Those words no longer burned as shame, but as fuel. She had carved her place with persistence and skill, and there was no denying it now. The breakthrough was not a single victory, but a series of undeniable results stacked one after another until the weight of them demanded recognition. She was no longer the young woman trembling with rejection outside glass doors. She was a professional whose work spoke louder than prejudice ever could. And with each step upward, she knew she was only getting started. Her time at the firm became the foundation for everything that followed. The projects she completed there carried her name into rooms she had not yet entered, and the results spoke for themselves. Other companies began to notice, first with curiosity, then with offers. She accepted opportunities that challenged her further, each move sharpening her skills and widening her network. People who had once dismissed her as ordinary now repeated her strategies in their own work. Her ideas began to shape not just one office, but the direction of the industry itself. With every step forward, she remembered the sting of that early rejection. Instead of letting it embitter her, she let it drive her. The weight of those words became a force she converted into momentum. She told herself she would never again allow her future to depend on whether someone else thought she was worthy. That thought grew into something larger, something that whispered to her at night and kept her awake with plans that stretched beyond her desk and into a vision of her own. It began small. She started consulting in her spare time, offering solutions to struggling businesses that others overlooked. She worked out of coffee shops and borrowed spaces, building her client list one meeting at a time. The first checks were modest, but each one proved she could create value on her own terms. Her reputation as a problem solver spread quietly, and soon she found herself with more clients than she could handle alone. That was when she made the decision that changed her life. She would build her own company. The beginning was chaotic. She rented a small office barely big enough for 2 desks, painted the walls herself, and used secondhand furniture bought with savings she had scraped together. She hired her first employee, then her second, both young professionals who reminded her of herself in earlier days. She led them not as a distant boss, but as someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be underestimated. She pushed them hard, but she listened just as hard, cultivating a culture where effort and ideas mattered more than appearances or pedigree. Clients responded to her approach with enthusiasm. Word spread that her firm delivered results faster and with more care than the larger companies weighed down by bureaucracy. She earned contracts others thought were beyond her reach. With each success, she reinvested, expanding her team, renting larger spaces, and building systems that could support even bigger ambitions. Before long, she was no longer just a name whispered in professional circles, but a leader others looked to for direction. Her company grew into a beacon of what persistence could create. She walked through offices filled with employees she had hired, their voices blending into the hum of a business alive with purpose. She remembered walking into interviews where she had been dismissed without a chance, and now she was the one deciding who to bring in. She made it her mission to hire widely, giving opportunities to those who, like her, had been told they were not enough. In time, her influence extended beyond her own company. She was invited to speak at conferences, her words drawing crowds who wanted to know how she had done it. Industry leaders sought her advice, acknowledging her as a figure of leadership. She no longer fought to be seen. She had become impossible to overlook. The industry that once shut its doors on her now looked to her for guidance, and she carried that responsibility with both pride and the steady reminder of where she had begun. The lobby looked exactly as she remembered it, polished marble floors stretching wide, framed photographs of executives lined neatly on the walls, and the same faint scent of coffee drifting from the reception desk. Years had passed, yet stepping through those doors again sent a rush of memory through her chest. She recalled sitting nervously on one of the leather chairs, resume clutched tightly in her hands, hope fluttering so wildly inside her that it almost drowned out her fear. She remembered the glance from the hiring manager, the quick judgment in his eyes, and the words that had followed her like a shadow for so long. Now her heels clicked confidently against the marble, and the folder she carried was not a resume begging for consideration, but documents confirming ownership. The receptionist looked up, startled, her polite script faltering as recognition rippled through the staff in the lobby. They whispered her name, some with disbelief, others with awe, because everyone in the industry knew the company she had built. They knew the deals she had closed, the innovations she had led, the way her name had become a standard for excellence. And now they knew that she was not here for a meeting or a negotiation. She was here because the company that once dismissed her had been acquired by hers. She approached the elevator with steady steps, her reflection mirrored in the golden doors. She studied her own image briefly, the sharp lines of her tailored suit, the calm strength in her posture, and the quiet fire in her eyes. She thought of the young woman who had once stood here trembling, desperate to be seen. That girl still lived inside her, but she had been transformed by years of struggle, by countless nights of study and work, by the grit it took to carve her own path when none had been offered. When the elevator opened onto the executive floor, the hum of conversation stilled. The very halls that had once felt distant and closed off now seemed smaller under her gaze. Employees peered out of glass offices, their eyes widening as she passed. At the far end, the same manager who had dismissed her years ago stood waiting, his face pale, his composure brittle. He had been told she was coming, but the reality of her presence seemed to weigh on him more than he had expected. She did not rush. She let each step remind her of the journey, of the years spent building what he had once told her she could not be part of. When she reached him, she paused only briefly before extending a hand. He hesitated, then shook it, his eyes flickering with something that looked like regret. She offered him a polite smile, not sharp, not cruel, but firm. The kind of smile that acknowledged the past without letting it control the present. The meeting that followed was not long. Papers were signed, formalities completed, and the ownership transfer confirmed. The staff sat around the long boardroom table, watching as she outlined the new vision, her voice clear and steady. No one dared interrupt. No one doubted her authority. She had come full circle, but she was not the same woman they had once turned away. She was their leader now, the one holding the future of the company in her hands. As she looked out across the room, she thought again of the rejection that had once seared her pride. It no longer hurt. It no longer humiliated. It had become the spark that fueled everything she had built, and standing in the company that had once told her they were not ready, she realized she had never needed their permission to rise. She had created her own place, and now she had returned not to ask for acceptance, but to show what persistence could achieve. The room was filled with the hum of cameras clicking, the glow of spotlights bouncing off polished glass walls, and the low murmur of reporters waiting for her to speak. The press conference had been announced only days earlier, yet every major outlet had sent someone to cover it. The story had already spread through the industry like fire. The company that had once turned her away, that had dismissed her without hesitation, now belonged to the woman they had refused to hire. She stepped up to the podium with steady grace, the tailored lines of her suit sharp beneath the bright lights. The gold lettering of her company's name shone on the backdrop behind her, and the room fell quiet as she adjusted the microphone. She looked out across the sea of faces, not flinching at the flashing cameras or the curious stares. For a brief moment, she thought of the younger version of herself, clutching a resume in a lobby chair, heart pounding as she waited to be judged. That girl had walked out with humiliation burning in her chest. The woman standing here now carried no shame. She began softly, her voice calm yet strong, each word deliberate. She introduced herself not as the company's first black employee, the position she had once begged for, but as their new boss. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of surprise and admiration spreading instantly. She let the silence stretch for a heartbeat before continuing, allowing the weight of the moment to settle on every ear in the room. She spoke of dignity, of the importance of recognizing humanity before titles, of the harm done when doors are closed, not because of merit but because of prejudice. She told the story without bitterness, without raising her voice, but with a steady clarity that pierced the silence. She described the years of long nights, the sacrifices that had gone unseen, the countless times she had been underestimated. She reminded them that perseverance is not born in comfort but in the struggle to keep moving when the world tells you to stop. Reporters scribbled furiously, the sound of pens scratching loud in the quiet hall. Cameras flashed, catching the fire in her eyes, as she spoke of true success. Success, she said, was not in the corner office or the title on a business card, but in proving wrong those who had tried to silence you. Success was in carrying yourself with dignity even when others tried to strip it from you. Success was in creating opportunities not just for yourself, but for those who would come after, so they would never again hear the words she had heard. Her employees, both old and new, sat in the front rows, listening with rapt attention. Some nodded, others blinked hard against emotion, because they knew her story by now. They knew what it meant for her to stand here, not as a token, not as a symbol, but as the leader who had built something strong enough to claim its place at the top. When she finished, the applause came first in waves, then in thunder. It rose from the staff who had followed her vision, from the reporters who had come expecting a headline but found themselves moved by something deeper, from those who saw in her triumph a reminder of what persistence could achieve. She stood still, taking it in, not for pride, but for the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth. She had walked back through the same doors that once rejected her, but she had not returned seeking acceptance. She had come back with her own power, her own authority, and her own voice. And now the world was listening.